started. We are recording this. We love having people here in person on screen together in this virtual space to have this conversation, but we also recognize that there are people who this time does not work for and would like to be able to visit this at another time. So we do record these and put them on our YouTube. Your faces are not shown. What is shown in the recording is my face and Stephen's face, along with the slides that we will be sharing. We are on Zoom. We will be sharing two presentations. Today, we're looking at dining in detention at our two gateways. I will be sharing about Angel Island after Stephen shares about Ellis Island. During our presentations, absolutely, if you have questions, go ahead and stick them in the chat. We will try to get to them as we can, but also we will have a Q&A at the end that's really meant to be putting our two sites into conversation and to seeing how those are working out. So please do be active in the chat. You can start off right now if you don't mind just putting in the chat where you're joining us from. I always like to see where geographically we all are. I am currently in Palos Verdes in Southern California. And Stephen, where are you joining us from?
I am joining you from Brooklyn.
Fantastic. So yeah, we are at minimum bi-coastal here, but my guess is we have some more people from other places. And again, this is a conversation. I'll have questions, Stephen will have questions, you all will have questions, and we'll all do our best to answer each other's questions. And because we are going to be in conversation and really digging into this idea of food, I'd also like for us to consider what food and dining means to us, what can be communicated through the use of food. For me, I right away am thinking about, I just moved, so maybe that's why I'm thinking about this, but I'm thinking about being welcomed to a new place and being welcomed when my neighbors had me over for dinner the other night, and that was just very kind and a very welcoming gesture. Stephen, what does food communicate for you?
I mean, food communicates, it communicates a lot in terms of emotion and your sense of place. I think on Ellis Island, we see food traditions being carried just about, oh, probably second only to religion. The things that people hold dear to their heart. It's what higher power do you worship? How do you sit down and share and break bread with your fellow human beings? Or do you not? And what does that mean? What does it mean to eat alone? What does it mean to eat food that's kind of weird? It makes you feel even more alone, right? Like, what am I doing here? What is this thing? How do I eat this? There's a lot of security that comes from food that we know and food that we like. So I
Yeah.
think it really connects it. It sort of gets it sort of like vibrates all of the cockles of your heart and those emotions from long ago or not so long ago too.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you say is both the opportunity of connection, of heartwarming, but also the opportunity for there to be some distance, some othering that's coming through food.
Totally.
Um, and that's going to carry through our presentations. You and I both know
Yeah,
that.
totally, yeah.
But as we're going through, as we're thinking about food, if you all in the audience are having connections or thoughts, share them in the chat. Gabe is here as well, and he will be making sure that what's happening in the chat is being translated over to Stephen and I, and that we're seeing it. So I know I said that Stephen was going to go first, but I wanted to share this picture, or these two pictures of the kitchens at Ellis Island and Angel Island. It's Angel Island on the left and Ellis Island on the right. And I guess I'll ask the audience, what stands out to you in these pictures? I'm seeing a message from Julianne about the messages that food carries. Food can really demonstrate power. My relatives who came through both islands either did not have their normal food or had to request something special. And it really shows who is normal, even in marginalized context. Absolutely. Gail is seeing that there's two Asian men in the image. Do we see any similarities between these two kitchens? Okay, we're seeing some different tools. Both look really industrialized. Absolutely. These are industrial kitchens.
Industrial in scale. Absolutely. A lot of people being fed.
Right. This isn't our home kitchens, right? These are going to be for lots of people. And Angel Island's kitchen is actually based off of Ellis Island's kitchen. A lot of the dining experiences and the spaces and the equipment is very much based off of Ellis Island. And we'll talk about that as we go through, but for now, I'm going to stop sharing my version of the screen and hand this over to Stephen and his portion of the presentation.
All right. Did I do that successfully, Danielle?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I'm Stephen Lee. I'm the director of the American Family Immigration History Center, and I'd like to talk about manifests and menus at America's Golden Gate. On Ellis Island, we'll do a little bit of history just to give you an idea of some of the scope of the people that were in this sort of dining room system. Busiest times of Ellis Island during those peak years, you could see 5,000 to 6,000 people a day. 20% of those were detained. It doesn't mean they were detained for a long time or maybe even long enough to enjoy a meal, so to speak, on Ellis Island. But you see that there's the potential for several hundred or even 1,000 people a day to be caught in this detention system and to be responsible for feeding and clothing them and housing them on Ellis Island. And during peak years, 1892 until the early 1920s, those detention times were short. And we know that because on detention records, they're measuring the length of someone's stay on Ellis Island by the number of meals they ate. And you can see on the left-hand side, there's a list that says breakfast, dinner, and supper. So most of these folks, they're only having like 2 breakfasts, 2 lunches, 2 nighttime meals. Some of them, it's completely dashed out. Maybe they weren't around long enough, but you can get a sense that these people were not hanging around very long. Later, after the passage of National Quota Acts in the 1920s, detention times on Ellis Island became a lot longer. This record is for George Voskovich, the actor who starred opposite Henry Fonda in the 1953 film 12 Angry Men. He actually stayed on Ellis Island just over 11 months. He's marked TD for temporarily detained, and he stayed for quite a long time. That just reflects the political reality of Ellis Island really being a center of detention, not inspection. So as we see evolutions in the immigrant experience, we're going to see evolutions in the dining experience too. The first building on Ellis Island, so 1892, it lasted until 1897 when it burned to the ground because it's made entirely of wood. On the right-hand side of this slide, this is the only interior photo of that building that I've ever seen. And we don't even get to see the dining room. This is the registry room where all those immigrants were being lined up and inspected. We do see newspaper articles like 1894. There's an article about immigrants having Thanksgiving dinner on Ellis Island. Not a lot of information for us, though. Ellis Island as it exists today, in this building that was finished in 1900, the big main building in sort of the middle of this picture, it actually had many, many dining rooms. Everywhere you see a blue arrow on this photo, that's a documented dining room. Every wing of the hospital had a dining room, both for the wards and for the employees. The administrative employees had a dining room, but I'm going to focus more on the detainees, that main dining room where you see all those pictures of hundreds of folks having food. Something else that gets in our way is being a government building that managed to last several decades. The rooms that we're talking about were used for many different things at different times. The cafeteria on Ellis Island is in this northeast corner of the main building. That's the cafeteria that visitors go to now. Danielle, when you and your partner were here, you guys visited. I think you had a sandwich there. And you
Yeah.
can see at different times, this could be a registrar's office, this could be the medical examination room, this could be a medical division office. Every era of Ellis Island, they're shifting these usages around. So it makes it a little bit difficult to track down where these folks were actually having the experience. What I can tell you is that most of the pictures that you see of immigrants having a dining room experience on Ellis Island, most of those photos were taken in this little building off to the side of the main building here, where this blue arrow is pointing, the second floor dining room in the kitchen and laundry building. That's where most of those photos are from. Well, how do we know that? We have guidebooks from Ellis Island peak years that mention a lot of things. They mention that you're up in the third floor visitors gallery and you go downstairs and you're in this dining room. And the dining room is closed to visitors when the immigrants are in there. This isn't like a celebration where you can bring your family and friends that are coming to visit you while you're detained. You're segregated from the general population. We know that the seating capacity is around 1,000, and there are so many people being detained. It usually takes 2 or 3 seatings a day. And in between those seatings, sometimes the dishes and silverware aren't washed properly. Sometimes the cleanup is a little bit sloppy and hurried, and all those things that we can imagine. We can also see clues inside of the photographs. These windows that the arrows are pointing to, these little cute, fancy oval windows, those only exist one place in all the buildings on Ellis Island. It's outside of the kitchen and laundry. So that's how we know. I took this picture just a couple of days ago. That's how we know when we're looking at an interior shot and we're seeing these oval windows. That's how we know where they are in this big complex of buildings. That's the only wall, that's the only building where those shapes of windows exist. And even though that dining hall was in use for a long time, there were redesigns. This is the earliest photo that I can find of the dining hall, and you see there's dark wood paneling, there's wood tables, very simple cutlery, very simple place settings. It could be a bowl or a plate, depending on if you had soup or something more solid. You have buckets underneath the tables for the food trash. This is not a great photo, but it does kind of show you the shape of that dining room when they first opened it in 1902. And then as the years went on, the space dedicated to the dining hall grew. And in 1904, that's actually when those oval windows are installed. And they put up tin molding around the ceilings that you can see at the top of this picture. The tables get a lot heavier, benches look a lot sturdier, silverware looks a little bit sturdier, big hunks of bread, soup, really like hearty, simple dishes that they're serving. And then as you go on, you're going to see even more changes. They're going to take away that tin molding. They're going to add tile wainscoting up to, about shoulder height on a grown person. They're going to take away all those sharp edges. There's no right angles where the column meets the ceiling, because if you have corners, you collect dirt and all kinds of schmutz from all of this environment of people with food splattering out, hundreds of people moving through this space. These were really cleanliness improvements, because it's a lot easier to clean tile. And they're putting paper down on the table so that between seatings, they can just roll it up with all of the food stuff in there and throw it away. It makes it a lot quicker, a lot easier to get more people in and out. 1911, a kosher kitchen was added. And this picture is of Sadie Schultz, who worked for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and she ran the kosher kitchen at this point in Ellis Island history. So what did people eat, and did they like it? You're going to see 3 different narratives at Ellis Island. One from the people who ran the place, one from people who were here visiting, just having looky-loos, and 3, you're going to see stories from the detainees themselves. And all of these narratives run parallel to each other. So it really depends on what point of view you're getting. A visitor and a reporter named Ernest Hamlin Abbott wrote in Outlook magazine in 1902 about people making their way to the dining room, losing no time. They're getting big bowls of soup, generous plates of fish and potatoes, and steaming coffee. No sound except for the clinking of dishes and of eating. And you're thinking, okay, that sounds reasonable. It sounds a little hectic, but a big turning point came under Teddy Roosevelt's administration. And when he visited the island in 1903, part of his reform movement, reforming the bureaucracy, reforming other government services, but certainly on Ellis Island, it was about reforming the way that people were treated here, detained and not detained alike. So a couple of years after this reform movement started to take place, we have an anonymous writer for Outlook magazine writing this. Great dining rooms with their long tables and hot soup and mighty slices of rye bread. And the official from Ellis Island is quoted as saying, "It is so much better than anything they've ever had that they weep and lament over having to leave Ellis Island at all." Pardon my editorial chuckle at that. Nobody wanted to stay on Ellis Island. But remember, this is the point of view of somebody who was an Ellis Island official. And when we look at menus from 1906, we see some things that are pretty hard. Like, it doesn't look so bad to us. Breakfast, coffee and milk, lots of bread and butter. Dinner, what they're calling lunch, there's usually some kind of meat, but like a meat soup or a meat stew. I pointed out that this was before the kosher kitchen was built. So there is the option, what they're calling herring for Hebrews, people who are keeping kosher. And at supper, it's usually something a little bit lighter, not usually meat. This is around Thanksgiving time in 1906. And you see mention of crackers and milk for women and children. You'll see that throughout. Whenever you see that, this is an actual picture a little bit later in Ellis Island history of one of the kitchen staff pouring out milk for women and children. You could also buy boxed food. You could buy 2 pounds of bread for 8 cents, 4 pies for 20 cents, apples and oranges. Just keep in mind, this is not cheap for them. This is sort of like buying food at a mall food court or at the airport. There are actually reports of people complaining about how expensive the boxed lunches were at Ellis Island. In 1913, there's another push for reform, and it all starts with mentioning in newspapers about how President Wilson had rejected all bids for Ellis Island food vendors. And Hudgens and DeMoss had this contract. They underbid everybody. And it was so unrealistic that they could supply the grade of food that they specified at that figure. They were just completely rejected. And there was actually a discussion in the cabinet as to whether immigrants could get the quality food that the government expects them to have. And they started an Ellis Island Inquiry Commission that same summer. And all kinds of things started coming out for and against the food on Ellis Island. Former President Taft, who can be seen here on Ellis Island with Commissioner Williams, he said the food is great. These investigative journalists were saying it was terrible. And then finally, you get this headline of Ellis Island served bad meat. And this chef from Ellis Island's peak years was saying that he basically was compelled to use meats that were bad. And this chief witness against the government, Alfred McCann, who's a private investigator, says a lot of things in this article. And I'd like to point a couple of them out because it's really telling. And the government has decided calorie values for food of different races. And he's saying the food here is so bad, it's so meager, these meals might suffice for a Japanese, but not for your average immigrant. And the government specifies the cost of meals at 8 cents each, so like 25 cents a day, but quality is not specified. Long story short, nobody really got punished for any of this, but President Wilson did appoint Dr. Frederick Howe as commissioner in 1914. He's a noted reformer. One of the things he did was he invited homeless men, up to 750 of them, most of whom were immigrants themselves, to spend the night on Ellis Island over the winter of 1914 and 15. And they were provided beds and breakfast, coffee and bread at the cost of around 5 cents each. So things are starting to look kind of up. And if we get to an oral history that we have on Ellis Island of a young man named Oreste Telia, who came from Italy. He was in the hospital for about a week. And we start to see like, hey, things are okay, but there's still some othering going on here. He says, we got oatmeal for breakfast. I didn't know what that was with the brown sugar on it, you know? So I couldn't get myself to eat it. And I put it out on the windowsill for birds to eat. And did the nurses ever wonder why you weren't eating? And he said, well, no, I mean, the nurses couldn't talk, we couldn't communicate. But of course, we had milk and bread and different things. And when they asked if he was fed in bed 3 times a day, he said yes. But each time we were fed, they took head counts. There's always a reason behind this. These people were being monitored. It wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a very practical reason. These people were being detained after all. And that to me would never let you forget that you were being detained. You're not a guest here. And when the US jumped into World War I, we started getting, quote, enemy aliens interned on Ellis Island. And then things got really complicated because these enemy aliens, they were in organized units like these German seamen who formed a committee. They had a bigger platform to advocate for themselves, and they did just that. They wrote to the Secretary of State via the legation of Switzerland complaining about the food. And the response from the assistant commissioner was basically, you know, we can't have people sending fresh food here. We only need non-perishable stuff. And by the way, guys, we're at war, so we're advocating the conservation of food for everybody. So if you're not getting the best food, hey, it's wartime. What do you expect? And he released the menus that these men were complaining about. And these look really similar to the ones in 1906, oatmeal and rice for breakfast, some kind of midday meal with beef broth, lima bean soup, boiled corned beef. The suppers look a little bit more substantial. And of course, you've got the milk and crackers for women and children too. But these complaints continued. And even in 1919, there was a hunger strike among some of these German detainees. And the response was pretty much the same from the commissioner saying, hey, this food is okay. I've never heard anybody complain about it. If you don't like the fact that we're not using a lot of sugar to sweeten, or there's not a lot of spices, nobody's getting a lot of sugar because of rations. And of course, you always have a helpful letter to the editor about this time after World War I, when a story was written about immigrants having a holiday meal of turkey for Thanksgiving on Ellis Island. Someone describing himself as a former doughboy writes in and says, well, gee, when I was in France, I was eating horse meat, but it's so great that all of these Bolsheviks and conscientious objectors were getting turkey. So even if you were an administrator on Ellis Island, you were doing your best to try to get people quality, nourishing food. You're probably not going to win. You're probably either going to go too far in one direction or another, depending on some opinionated person that might write into the daily news. And when we enter the post-peak experience, we see the levels of people at Ellis Island drop, but we see a lot more accounts of what was going on. Konstantin Obruchev was a Russian immigrant. He was not a Bolshevik, but he was held at Ellis Island for exceeding a quota. But the important thing to remember about this is that he and his wife, they were traveling second cabin. So that's the only reason they were at Ellis Island, was because they were being detained. And in his account, he says that I noticed the distinction that was made between immigrants of different cabins. First and second class passengers were seated on chairs, third class on benches, and a similar distinction was made in rations. And he's saying the dinner was tasty and plentiful, but when I looked over at those third class immigrants that were seated apart, I noticed their menu was not as well chosen, nor was it as generous. And if you look at a menu from this time, like on the right-hand side of the slide, it looks like everybody's being treated equally. But we have this detainee saying, no, that's not the case. And you get positive and negative reactions. People who were visiting, like this journalist and writer for International Council of Women, Betsy Kjelsberg from Norway, she's saying, you know, this kitchen is very well equipped and up to date. But then you have other writers and other reporters like John Walker Harrington who write this lengthy article in Forum magazine, not necessarily about the food, but about the lack of cleanliness on Ellis Island. So, you know, you get both sides of that picture. And really, as the further you get into this detention era, the conditions seem to stabilize. And by the 1930s, you're you're getting a lot of mention of special arrangements being made for both people of Jewish and Mohammedan backgrounds for their dietary restrictions. They're even saying, hey, we're getting ice cream twice a week. Look at how progressive this is. They're not feeding as many people, and they're really getting into the groove of being a detention center, I think. And you can see from this picture from 1937, these portions look much more advanced. The silverware and the dining room itself, even though it's the same room, it looks a lot different than what we saw just maybe like a couple of decades ago. And something that's a little bit of a side note, that I think is really cool is that in the dining room, for a WPA project, there was a mural painted about the role of immigrant in the industrial development of America, painted by Edward Lanning, who is with his back to the camera in this picture. And you can see it in the background in multiple photos from this time. This photo from 47, detainees are there having dinner, and there's this beautiful mural sort of working its way over and around the doorway and the frames of the windows. It encompasses about half of the room. And today, those murals are actually, thanks to NPS efforts in the 60s and 70s, it's in the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, which is where my husband was naturalized and where hundreds of people every year are naturalized. And so when they take their oaths of citizenship, they're doing it underneath this little bit of Ellis Island history too. And that's why they're shaped like that, because they were going around windows and doors. We get to a really special oral history that I like a lot for Neo Suzuki. He's actually a US citizen. And like many people whose parents were Japanese immigrants, he did go back to Japan with his family. He returned to the US in 36. We see that manifest just down here in the bottom of the slide. Moved to New York in 1939. And after Pearl Harbor, was interned on Ellis Island for about a year and a half. And he says in his oral history, the one thing I didn't have to worry about is how I'm going to eat, because they provided the food. And let me tell you, the food wasn't too good. The menu never changed. It was every week. It repeated Monday and Tuesday. And then I think there were more German internees or incarcerated. So I think they catered more to the Germans. And he tells the tale of a lot of Japanese captives and detainees being sold things like pig knuckle, Swiss cheese, sauerkraut, and they didn't want to eat that. So when the guards weren't looking, they would switch their plates with German internees' empty plates, and he would actually manage to sneak bread up to his room and make toast on the radiators. This picture of the Ellis Island kitchen, I'm including that in this slide because all of those gentlemen you see working in the kitchen are enemy aliens. They are internees. They're detained people on Ellis Island who were put to work in the kitchen. And after World War II, that dining hall, it moves down to the first floor. You can see it's a much bigger space. The ceilings are higher, but in terms of seating, it was a lot smaller. They moved it there for security reasons, because they didn't want people having to go all the way from one end of this campus to another to be fed. They moved it closer to where the dormitories were. But then the INS reported that the detainee population exploded because of the Internal Security Act that was passed in 1950, and it immediately posed a problem of space because remember, the old dining room seated about 1,000. This new dining room only seated about 300. And so these era of long detentions, we have a lot of details. The number of detainees, like 300, 400 or so during the last 2 years of Ellis's operation. Of course, the complaints continued from the detainees. In 1948, there's 5 alleged German communists who were staging a hunger strike. We also get an idea about how the costs increase. From 1948 to 1950, we go from like 25 cents a day. It's a little bit over $1 a day when you include labor. Still food items available at the canteen for a little bit higher prices. But you can see these parallel narratives, detainees, visitors, and Ellis Island officials running right up until Ellis Island was abandoned in 1954. And that's, in a nutshell, kind of what the Ellis Island dining experience was. And I'm going to stop sharing, stop hogging the spotlight, and let Danielle take it away with sort of the other side, that other side of the bi-coastal story that we're telling tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I mean, I'm still thinking about just when you shared that women and children are sort of clumped together
Yep.
as one group, that women are, smaller humans, I guess.
I mean, there are pictures of
Children.
Ellis Island where there are men and women eating together, and then there are pictures where they're segregated by gender identity. Um, it- Ellis Island, when you try to find a straight answer about something because it was just functioning for so long, the rules just keep on changing. And I think that's immigration history in general. But Ellis Island seems to be especially prone to that. But maybe you'll prove me wrong, and Angel Island will be even more topsy-turvy than Ellis. But
I mean,
thank you guys.
that's one of the things I was thinking about too, is that one of the differences in our two sites is that you have a much longer history, right? From 1892 to 1954, whereas we're really looking at 1910 to 1940. And so
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about how those different timelines are just impacting these stories as well. Um, but that's a nice segue because the experience at Angel Island in every case, and dining included, is an experience of segregation and separation. And so let's pull up my screen. Here we go. So this is the picture we've already looked at, just looking at these two kitchens. Again, the Angel Island setup was very much modeled after the physical setup of Ellis Island. And there's a report, a memo that comes out after the kitchens have been open. The kitchen on Angel Island opens. They're like, why did you spend $1,300 on an oven? These ovens don't get used. Barely any bread is eaten on this island. And so in the building of this kitchen, they weren't really thinking about the population that was going to be coming through here or thinking about catering the food. This was set up as a very standard American kitchen to function on a larger basis. And so what we have in here, the physical space, has an oven and has steam as the heating functions. And so later on, there are other memos of being like, we don't have woks, we can't cook anything like that. And so thinking about, again, the Chinese population being the largest population being detained on Angel Island, but the food not necessarily being thought of from a cultural perspective from them, at least at the very beginning, and in the physical setup of what they're able to do in this space. And so this is just a reminder of the population coming through, that it is a diverse population. If we look at just, all of the countries that are represented, there are 80 countries. But the largest number of people are coming from China, followed by Japan, followed by South Asian immigrants, then Russian and Jewish, Korean, Filipino, Mexican, right? And then also other European immigrants as well. And the dining experience was one of segregation. The spaces were different. I don't have a picture that I was able to find of the European dining room. This is of the Asian dining room, both of these pictures. And so they have these long wooden tables. The wooden tables, according to a memo I read, were built in. So the table itself doesn't move, but there were benches that I guess do move. Whereas the European dining room, the records I was able to read, or the accounts I was able to read, were the tables were smaller. They had tablecloths. They used ceramic plates and silverware. Whereas in the Asian dining room, what was being used was, it looks more like, if we zoom in on some of these, more metal, and there were no tablecloths. And the food wasn't given on a plate to you. You got there and everything was sort of set up at the tables, which we can see on the right-hand side here. And then you helped yourself to it in this space. But I'd like to spend, oh, great. So thinking about just where we are on the site. If you joined us for Gateways Part 1, this might look like a familiar map, but the administration building doesn't exist anymore. It burned down in 1940, and isn't the only reason that Angel Island closed as an immigration station, but it definitely hurried that process. And so if you come to the site now, it's not a building that you would see, which makes these virtual opportunities so exciting because we're able to zoom in on things that don't exist anymore. And we can deeply study these historic images. But this helps us see that there are differences. So this is the space up in the top left corner here of the dining room space. And this is just it zoomed in. So the Chinese-Japanese dining room is physically larger than the European dining room, which is just showing the difference in numbers, right? It's a much larger Asian population that's spending time here, and especially time where you're eating. They're only really feeding people here for the most part who are being detained here. And many European immigrants aren't necessarily being detained, they're being processed and going out, or also many of them are not even getting off their boats, right? First class passengers are being processed on the boat, they're not coming here. So thinking about how food works in that way, right? But this is an artist rendering of thinking about the food because the meals are different. Not only is the physical space different for the different populations, but what people are being fed and how much money is being spent on it. So I have two different records to look at the amount of money that's being spent. This could be due to different ways of calculating, right? What is calculating just food and one is calculating sort of the cost of feeding an immigrant as possible. It's also possible that it's different in time period or in the concessionaire. But there's a 1909 concessionaires record. So this is right before they open. So that could be two. It could be about forecasting what's going to be spent versus what ends up being spent. Again, there's a lot of gray area in some of this. But in 1909, the concessionaires are saying that they are going to spend 14 cents per Asian meal, 15 cents per European, and 25 cents per employee meal. So again, we can very quickly see what the hierarchy and what value is being placed on these different individuals. And this is set up right as an artist rendering. The plates didn't look exactly like this. And again, the Asian population is showing up and sort of gathering food. And we have oral histories from different people who worked in the kitchen, one of them being Mr. Lowe, who we'll talk about a little bit more later. But he said that they would make a lot of rice for the Asian populations. And he worked in the station from 1923 to 1924. And so many people could have seconds of rice, but they didn't cook more of the main courses. And we can look at what these main courses look like for the European population. And some of this looks fairly similar, right, to Ellis Island. If we're looking at what's happening here, we got oatmeal. And, you know, there are these different options. They have a much more robust menu and much more varied. You know, there's macaroni soup. We got roast or fried beef, fresh fish, baked or boiled, beef stew, mutton stew, stewed prunes, applesauce, pie, bread pudding with raisins, tapioca pudding, fresh bread with wholesome butter. I just like that, like the call out of wholesome butter here. I like butter. Maybe I'll start calling.
I like wholesome butter the best. So
yeah, I'm gonna start
as
asking
opposed to
for
unwholesome butter. Yeah.
Versus that unwholesome butter.
Right. You know, you got to watch out for it.
For sure. Whereas for the Asian population, it is much more limited. Bean soup, boiled rice, relishes, bread and tea. And if there are Chinese among the detained, boiled beef, pork, or fish to be supplied upon request. That request process, I'm not totally clear on what that looked like and if it was always met or if there was a cost involved in that. Midday meal, boiled rice, cooked vegetables with fish or meat or salt, salmon, pickles, bread, and tea. Evening meal, boiled rice, cooked vegetables with fish or meat or salt, salmon, pickles, bread, tea. And this is also a place where we have varied accounts of what was happening. This is sort of an official menu. But again, we have accounts from people who worked or were detained, and they said that for the Asian meals, it was every other day you got the same food. So, on day A, you got congee, and they asked what was in the congee, and he said just very finely chopped pork. That's it. And then on day B, you got tapioca soup, which seemed to just be tapioca flour and water. And the interviewer asked, like, did people get full off of tapioca soup? He said that wasn't really the point, and that people could purchase other things alongside of it, which tells me that no, they're not getting full off of tapioca soup. I think that this is such an amazing image. There's so much, so dynamic. There's so many things going on here, that I'd love to just pause and give everybody a second to take it in. And maybe if you'd be willing to share in the chat what stands out to you, or what do you think is on some of the different people's minds here. That's quiet.
I see a man sort of middle and a little bit to the right, and he has this big, I guess it's a cracker in his hand. But the expression he's making, it doesn't look like a good cracker. Like maybe it's a really hard, maybe not even a cracker. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
This kid over here to me looks like he's just like really contemplating something.
Yeah, I think about that. When you sit kid down, like a kid sits down at a table, they automatically like their hands go and they start like eating, and he's just kind of sitting there. And I don't know if I'm just reading too much into it, but and there's a child sitting sort of across from him, closer to the camera, and they're just kind of like, I don't know, they're not excited. And when I think
Yeah.
of meals as a kid, I think of being excited, like yum. I don't see a lot of yum going on here.
Yeah, and Julianne sort of echoes some of your things in the chat. They're saying it looks like it's just men and boys, and they look like they're just eating, but they're not super happy. And also a question is above that of what kind of pickles and relishes. That's a great question. I would love to know. I don't know exactly. Right? This is a place where we have sort of these records to look at, but thinking about them not feeling maybe super joyful or happy to be here, this is a highly regulated environment, right? So it's not like, oh, it's mealtime. This is a time of saying, like, you are eating at these times. So there's a 1917 record that says that the meal times were at 7:15 a.m., 1 p.m., and 4:15 p.m. And so this is very much, it's very regulated, right? It's something that you're just there. And we have another quote from an immigrant named Lee Puyu that says, after we ate, they took us back and locked the door, just like in jail. So this is a situation where they are being counted upon entering, they're being counted upon leaving, and then they don't have freedom of movement here. They're told, it's chow time. Chow, chow, chow is something that comes up in a lot of the oral histories that we have. And you sit here and you're sort of fighting for your food. It sounds like, they're not cooking quite enough food for everybody. It also sounds like the food wasn't very good, especially at the beginning of this experience. Again, we have this kitchen space. It's a huge industrial kitchen. They're feeding 600 to 700 immigrants a day. There's a lot going on, and the quality is not super great. And again, we should remember that Angel Island is on an island. Everything that's being fed to them is coming on ferries back and forth. well, I guess mostly in one direction. And so that food might not be enough food. This is a better, sort of more zoomed in picture of how the tables are set up ahead of folks coming in, but you would also buy things, right? And so we have back here, this is the one image we have of showing this shop that people can shop at, the commissary. And so we've gone through and done our best to try to zoom in on this picture and identify the different objects and items that people could buy. We weren't able to identify 100% of them, but there's this mix, right, of hygiene, canned goods, tobacco, multiple different types of tobacco, produce, oral care, bottled goods, dry goods, apparel, right? It's a broad thing. But apparently buying salted fish here, the canned salted fish was quite popular, at least among the Asian population, to add to the rice to get some more protein and maybe some different flavors, some, something really salty in there as well. But this wasn't just accepted. People didn't just say, oh, we're treated more poorly. There's different levels of food that's being fed. We're facing exclusion, right? After the Chinese Exclusion Act or the Asiatic Barred Zone, all of this is being pushed back upon. So on the left side of the screen here, you see just a screenshot that I took of a newspaper, the Imperial Valley Press from July 1st, 1925, that calls this a riot, a mess hall riot. So there are 2 such instances of people pushing back and protesting the food in the mess halls. And it seems, they broke plates, they shattered things, they weren't eating. They, for a couple days after one of them refused anything in the mess hall, but were buying things from the commissary instead to try to stand up and push for better food and better treatment. It never changed the amount of money that was spent on the Asian meals, but it does seem to have impacted the food that was being cooked. It seems that ahead of one of the so-called riots, they were being fed more of a Western type of meal. Whereas afterwards, the cooks started cooking things that were more Chinese in nature, and much of the staff in the kitchens, they were Chinese, and that seemed to change things. Again, that was hard to do because you couldn't have like a wok to stir fry things and do things like that. Again, it's steam heat and oven heat, and they would just make huge vats of rice. It seems to have been at least a little bit better. It also seems that the Japanese population was like, well, but that's not exactly that much better for what we're looking for. It's not culturally specific to our diet. There were also instances of different groups of immigrants working with their aid societies, and sort of groups that would help push for change. There was a group that helped supply kosher foods. It seemed like they were boxed foods for Jewish detainees at different periods of time. But the kitchen staff, again, they, many of them are Chinese, and they are using this opportunity of going back and forth from Chinatown to Angel Island. Most of them were only allotted to do this once a week or once a month. Again, the records and oral history seem to not be exactly the same on this. But they could make money off of hiding notes in the food or in the kitchen to then get that information to the detainees. And so on the right here, we see from the National Archives in DC coaching note inside of a banana that has a detailed village map on this. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is you might be coming in as a paper son or a paper daughter. So that's, you're claiming an identity that is different than your own. And you need to make sure that you have the right information that you're studying to align your story properly. Another thing that could happen is you could very well be coming in as your own true identity, but your family members are still going to be questioned about who you are. And they might say, oh, I said that Mr. Such and such lived across the street, but maybe you remember it's such and such different because he died at some point. So trying to make sure that we're getting information and saying, no, these are the stories that were to align stories, because if there were anything different, that was seen as a reason to deport you, or a reason for possible deportation. And there are different records into exactly how this worked. There are some oral histories that say, oh, if somebody told you like the rice is really good tonight, like you should look under the rice bowl for your note. Others say that they're inside things like walnuts or bananas or things like that. But it also could be time dependent and memory dependent. But this is to say that people stood up for themselves and pushed back against poor treatment. And making sure that we have, real people represented. This is Jiro Kobashigawa. He is also a US citizen, and he was born in 1914 in Arizona. His family also went back to Japan for a period of time. They were strawberry farmers, but he comes back to help make some more money for his family. And he comes in 1931, and he sat down for an interview in 1975. And these are some pieces of his interview. He says, the food was terrible. The soup was smelly, made from old meat. The rice was steamed, but hard. I couldn't eat. I only remember mealtime. They called chow chow. About 200 people dashed into the mess hall, sat down at the table and bench. But there were other Japanese men who were detained, that were being deported, and they heard his story and they petitioned the immigration officials to let them know that he was a US citizen and that this was a mistake that he was being detained here. And he says, I was immediately moved to another room. There I got to eat good food with the officers. I never saw those men again, the ones who helped me, but I'm so grateful to them. And so here we have somebody who's experiencing two different levels of food and saying one was really bad and one was inedible and one was good food. And again, we also have the accounts of kitchen workers. Mr. Lowe is not pictured here, but we have an oral history from him, and here's a couple of snippets of that. He says, we had separate smaller steamers. Someone scooped out the rice and put it on the cart, which was wheeled out and put on the table. There were only so many dishes. Rice could be refilled, but not the dishes. If that wasn't enough, you could eat salted fish until you were full. So that's, again, the one that you're buying. The dishes included soup. For example, if you had bean curd strips as the main course, it went nut in a soup. I don't know exactly what that means. Most people were not used to beef and potatoes, so there were a lot of leftovers of that. So you knew to make just a little. As to the syrup soup, tapioca, it went out with crackers. It was easy to make. Just boil water and add it. Usually the rice cooker made it. And with this is also, and he's saying too that what his daily schedule was, he got up at 4 a.m, meals were served at 6, then they got off at 1, went back to work at 2, then they worked until 4. There were a lot of people, and we got off at 4:30, and those days everyone worked 10 hours a day, so they're working long days. But something else that I just wanted to come back and look at this picture and think about as well is thinking about how this is being paid for, where this money is coming from and who is responsible for it. Is the immigration station would, and the shipping company would share the cost of feeding the immigrants for their first moments, I guess, first couple of days on Angel Island. And then if they were said to be deported, then they would be sent back. But if they appealed their case and they were still on Angel Island, that cost of those meals then is on the individual. And so that is then a bill that will be sent to you that you will have to pay for, or your family will have to pay for upon your leaving. That was a ton of information. From myself and Stephen all at once. We really ran down, but we have about 5 minutes left for questions. And so you can put them in the chat, or if you raise your hand or wave at your screen, if you turn your video on, we'll call on you. And you're welcome to share your question with your voice.
While people are gathering their thoughts, I just think, first of all, I agree with Julianne that it was really cool when we saw all the different products and you'd isolate it, that there's one kind of toothpaste, but like 5 kinds of cigarettes that they were selling, really like a a sign of the times in which they were operating. That's very, very cool.
Absolutely. And Julianne here says, wow, this was amazing. Oh, thank you. I'd love to hear about where Jewish immigrants ate on Angel Island and about what the East African immigrants on Angel Island ate. I would too. I was not able to find sort of more information. This was sort of the level of information I was able to get. Particularly the East African immigrants, we know very little about their experience on Angel Island. But it is definitely something that I hope that maybe we'll find some treasure trove of information on at some point.
I'm wondering if because on Ellis Island before the kosher kitchen was built, they did serve fish. Where you see on menus herring for Hebrews, and maybe if the Asian detainees diet included fish, if maybe that was an option, or at least in the eyes of an immigrant inspector or the immigrant officials. Um, that is a really interesting question because it was that
Yeah.
community was is well represented in Ellis Island's record, so they did respond to that in a pretty robust way with a separate kitchen and separate menu. Um, but Angel Island has no shortage of Jewish history happening there either.
Yeah, I have one record of an aid organization bringing matzah to the island at one point. Um, were Jewish immigrants counted as European for dining purposes? I think so. Yes. Um, I'm pretty sure that's the case. I've not, again, this isn't written in like a very specific way where it's like this person who is Jewish or would be listed as Hebrew, right, is in this specific location. The records, well, a lot of our records also burned down, which makes it less possible to find. But for the most part, yes. Yeah, I wish that people would leave histories with every single detail that we would want to know 100 years out or more. I used to work at the Tenement Museum in New York City. We always hoped that we would find a very detailed journal underneath the floorboards, but we never.
Right. Yeah, no matter how much they excavate on Ellis Island, we never find that treasure trove that has all the answers about, what was going on at this specific point in time in Ellis Island history. And it's like, didn't you guys know that there would be this big movement and there would be all these companies who are, their reason for existing or to help you track down your DNA and the thread of family history. But it says a lot about how valued these people were and that the information about them just wasn't valued the way that we do today with this sense of nostalgia and purpose.
Well, and it shows that people are valuable, whether or
Mhm.
not the US government decided they were valuable in that time period, right? The fact that we now today look back and want to look at it, we can see that the government is saying that some people are less worthy than other people by spending literally less money on them, right? But we know today we want to know about all of these people because all of these people make up our communities and our loved ones and our homes. And so maybe that's the lesson we can sort of leave with today. We are going to stick in the chat a survey. Just it helps us think about how these are going, what all you're looking for. One of the survey questions is other topics you would like Stephen and I to dig into, or Angel Island and Ellis Island to dig into, to be comparing across sites. And we definitely use those recommendations to think of other topics. And this is an ongoing series. Again, it's quarterly. So we'll have this again in just a couple months. We'll send out an email also afterwards that will have that survey link in it, but I highly recommend just clicking it now and starting that effort just right away while it's here. And if you do it, you have the possibility of winning a gift card. So that there's that. But really, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Stephen, for being in conversation with me. And this brings us to the end of our program.
Thank you so much, Danielle, and many thanks to Gabe Lee too. And thanks to everybody who showed up this evening or this night, depending on which coast you're on. and we'll be doing it again soon. Thank you.